Thank you for the invitation. Just listening to the last few minutes of the discussion, I have a lot of empathy for the idea of how do you teach the ancient world differently, because embedded in most of the ways that we think about human history actually are certain kinds of narratives, and they're very powerful and very difficult to get over. So what I'm going to do today is show you a case study that actually leads to some fairly, I think, convincing demonstrations that it's worthwhile to try to not see like a state. That's um, a paraphrase of a book that I'll talk a little bit about it in this. And part of the reason for doing this is to remind ourselves that the kind of nation states that we live in are really very recent. They only have a history of perhaps 300 years in the version that we have come to take of as normal. That is a government that polices the boundaries of a territory on the basis of the idea that there's a natural association of the population living within that territory with a specific history of being there that's signified in everything from a single shared language to a single shared culture. And as an anthropologist, one of the things I want to do is profoundly apologize for giving the world the concept of culture as a single shared thing, as opposed to the adjective cultural identity, cultural production, because that notion that a group of people living within a artificially bounded and governed territory is some sort of natural unit turns out not to actually be very useful. As an archaeologist, as a practicing archaeologist, for about the last 15 years, I've been tempted to write a paper called "Why Do Archaeologists Love the Wealthy So Much?" And that's not about today, although it is the case that many archaeologists consort with wealthy people today because private donations to fund field work is often appreciated. But because when you look at what archaeologists publish, there's often an emphasis on the wealthy, the powerful, the ruling people. So if we look at these two, I should say I'm a specialist in ceramics, so you're going to see a lot of pottery today. If we look at these two pots here, for example, on the left is an example of a polychrome pot from the classic Maya period, so basically 600 to 800 AD. On the right is a similar looking pot from the area that I work in, the Alua River Valley of Honduras. As we have been trained as archaeologists to look at things like this and to look for the person in power, in command. And some of the things that we interpret as evidence of power or command are being seated on slightly elevated thrones or seats, and appearing to us to be directing other people's actions. And that kind of an interpretive frame we bring to these things. What I'm going to try and do today is show you how to take the same things and look at them differently. Because in terms of that pragmatic question I heard people asking when I first came on board, one of the things we can do, and you can do it with pupils of any age, is actually say, so, where is the evidence in this for this particular kind of organization? On the left-hand side, the classic Maya are an example of a highly hierarchical state. And our evidence for that is that the people seated on elevated platforms here are named in the texts next to them with titles that emphasize that they're rulers, with titles that emphasize that they're warriors, with titles that mention their parentage. The pot on the right from the area I work in also has a person seated in an elevated place, but there's no similar kind of text telling us who the person is. And so that's one of the first things we should do, is appreciate that if we don't know who someone is, if we assign them a generic kind of a role, and we draw it from an assumption about how people organize their social lives and governance in the past, we're likely to privilege the thing that we're most familiar with, which is the nation state. The work that I've been doing on this, along with collaborators, has already recently resulted in 2 books in which we look at the visual culture, the rich visual products of the area that I work in, which is located in Western Honduras on the Caribbean coast and has classically been considered to be the margin or frontier of the Maya world. So I like to say that I work on the periphery of the Maya, and that means that I stand looking in towards Maya culture and asking questions that are different. Instead of asking the question about what seems inevitable, I ask the question, how did the Maya rulers ever manage to convince people to let them exercise so much power? So one of the things you can do is question the inevitability and ask, how did that happen? If you take for granted that humans inevitably will develop relations of power and command, if you take for granted that inequality is inevitable, you don't ask that question. When you start asking the question, how did Maya rulers concentrate so much power and wealth and command? You can unpack this, and you can do the same thing for any ancient civilization. The area that I'm working in was in the 16th century, in Spanish sources, described as occupied by a group of people speaking a language from the Lenka family, which is limited to Honduras and El Salvador. So that's another point of connection that I am going to emphasize today, is that even in places where we don't have written histories, but also in places where we have written histories, there may be kinds of useful things that a broader array of texts about descendant peoples can tell us. And so in this case, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I draw on Lenka ideas about how reality should be structured and how humans should relate to each other, and not just to each other, but to the entire world of beings around them. But I begin with this kind of visual materials. They're stylistically called Alua polychromes and Alua figurines for the river valley that I work in, where these things were made. That river valley itself is the largest tropical river valley in northern Central America. It drains about 80% of the territory of Honduras and has historically been a major center of banana plantations. And on the map, you can see in pink a sort of a distribution of Alua style material in the country. It borders directly on the style developed at the classic Maya center called Copan. And so this is a place where we can see how a highly unequal society and a very much less unequal society relate to each other, and can begin to take apart how the presumptions that are built into my discipline and are built into most histories, most histories share with archaeology, the idea that greater centralization and greater hierarchy are the norm. What I mean here is we could start with Copan. Copan fits very nicely in the narrative of increasing hierarchy and inequality. At Copan, there are historical monuments that show individuals, in this case a man, identified on the back with titles that say that he is the ruler of the site, engaged in a ritual or ceremony. At Copan, we can see that adjacent to these kinds of historical monuments, we find very large scale construction of houses that we can call the palaces of the rulers and of other noble families. And those contrast with the houses of most of the people who are farmers in the area. So this is the kind of pattern that seems very legible, very easy to interpret. That's what I want to call the sort of classic state image. And it directs our attention in ways that we need to be aware of. So when we find a stone monument in a place like the Alua Valley, and this is actually from my dissertation site, which is called Cerro Palenque, which was the largest village in the Alua Valley in antiquity. When we find something like this, we immediately compare a stone sculpture to a stone sculpture and ask the question, how does that relate to power, to the exercise of power? Who commissioned it? For whose benefit was it? So we've already assumed the stratification and the inequality. We go into the material thinking that that's what this is about. Alua polychromes are painted on a variety of bowls and these cylindrical cups, and it's conventional to show the scenes that wrap around them in this kind of rollout. If we approach things like this with the kind of state model in our mind, then when we see a scene, and you'll see that this is repeated twice on this vessel, when we see a scene that has someone who's seated on something that could be called a throne, facing two other people, we give more attention to the person on the throne than to the other two people. And one of the first things I want to point out is by doing that, we're ignoring a clue that the painters gave us, which is that they gave more visual space to the other people than to the person on the throne. So we might begin by actually asking who is being foregrounded in the actual art? Where are our eyes being directed? Where are we looking and where should we be looking? The valley that these things came from is one where I participated in the 1970s and 1980s in survey projects that resulted in our identifying over 500 archaeological sites that were occupied between 500 and 1000 AD in an 800 square mile valley. So that's a very large population. When we look at where these sites are, most of them are small house compounds distributed continuously along the streams in a pattern that matches the idea that these are farmers who are putting their house sites near water and fields. When we take a closer look of mapping these, we find clusters of these various raised platforms, some of them supporting multiple small buildings. On excavation, these buildings turn out to have rooms, some of them used as kitchens, others provided with benches. The drawing on the right is of the stone feature that you see here. And in that drawing on the right, on the top left, you're actually looking at a stone bench, the kind of thing someone might have slept on, excuse me. And from places like this, we recover all the tools in garbage, we recover all the tools of everyday life. Grinding stones to grind corn, pounding stones to pound a variety of palm fruits that were used in this area, which we know because from the stone tools used to cut plants, we can actually recover starches that tell us what plants they were used to cut. So we know that at Cerro Palenque, people were using obsidian or black volcanic glass to cut palm fronds, among other things. The bowls that people served food in their everyday life, but also other debris that suggests that people were engaging in the production of this kind of visual culture at small scale, intimate levels in households. So an assemblage like this can tell us about daily life. And it's by looking at these sets of materials about daily life that we begin to build up an idea of how much difference there was in the daily lives of people living in different places. Most of the people in those 500 archaeological sites that I described lived in relatively modest houses made of pole, thatch, and mud plaster that were renewed, rebuilt, generation after generation, with some occupations lasting for 300 or 400 years of remodeling of this in place, and the same places being used for as much as 1,000 years. In other words, we're looking at a very stable society in which people show a lot of resilience in a landscape where those major tropical rivers can flood their courses, and we see the evidence of flooding over generations, but in which this society was highly sustainable. So when we're looking at places like this, which are actually quite common in the areas described as civilizations, but haven't been the primary focus of most archaeological work or writing. When we look at these highly sustainable, long-term, resilient, stable societies, the kind of way that we talk about them matters. When I first started working in this area, people described this as stagnant and backward. And if you use stagnant and backward because they never developed the state, then what you're doing is showing that you're privileging, that you're lining up on the side of inequality. You become an advocate for inequality being not only natural and automatic or inevitable, but actually better. And so you have to try deliberately not to sign on to team inequality. And when you don't, what you can do is see that, in fact, there's a lot of sustainability that's associated with less unequal societies and a lot of fragility. The one thing almost everybody knows about classic Maya civilization is it collapsed. It's one of the great cases of civilizational collapse. Now, what collapsed was the government. The people didn't disappear. Farmers were still there. Farmers were still there in the 16th century when the Spanish invasion began. Farmers were still there because not everybody was drawn into the cities, which were the fragile places. Farmers were still there because they were practicing sustainable ways of managing this landscape. And those are alternative ways that we can get students interested in thinking about perhaps the less sexy. I mean, I guarantee you, this is these kinds of perishable, modest houses. They're not palaces. It isn't that there's no social difference, though, even in an area like this that has lesser inequality. So we also want to be very careful not to make this into a egalitarianism versus inequality. There's not just two ends of the spectrum. Instead, there's a lot of diversity. And so in the area that I work in, we have certain kinds of places, and this one site called Travessia, which is circled in blue here, and you can see it's along one of these river courses with continuous settlement, but it's a little bit different. Actually, it's quite a lot different. The household that lived at the center of Travessia built their houses out of carved stone blocks with thick plaster facing on the walls and floors, and enjoyed access to stone carving. They also built and apparently were the patrons of games played in a ball court, which is the two parallel structures shown at the bottom left. So in the normal run of thinking about inequality as natural, we would look at some place like Travessia and see this as the local evidence of the inevitable rise to greater complexity that we would expect. Okay. Oops, and now I've gotten off my. But that's again the same error that I already pointed out, that when we look at the painted pottery from this area, that's the error of looking at the person seated on the throne and giving them all the agency, all the attention, ignoring the fact that there's all these other people. And so instead, what I do in my work with this tradition is follow what the visual culture is showing me and ask, what are those people doing? Who are they? And what am I supposed to get out of this? Rather than bringing to it the idea that it's about hierarchy, with the person seated on the throne in the upper level or in the little house on the bottom as the commander of the others. I want to look at the people who are shown with more visual space. And so first I'm going to emphasize the top image here and then the bottom image. There's a number of versions of this same kind of imagery in Alua polychromes where you have one person watching two other people in a performance. And the performances basically fall into two categories. In some, like the ones on the top, people are engaged in burning tree resins in ceremonies. In others, like the ones on the bottom, people dressed in dance costumes with rattles and flutes and other musical instruments are taking part in other kinds of ceremonies or rituals. And these are things that archaeologically we actually find the evidence of. The actual physical remains from this kind of activity is what we recover. And in this very large area, 800 square kilometer valley, one of the things we've been able to show is that it's not just the wealthy or the centrally located people who are doing these kinds of things. The Monte Cale site, which is shown here, is actually an everyday farmstead, like most of those small perishable houses dotted around the landscape, where for at least 300 years, people repeatedly came and burned tree resins as incense in elaborate vessels with these sculptural figures on them, sculptural figures of humans on the right and of felines, which you can see one of down in the pit there. And that brings me back to the visual culture and makes me realize that what I'm being shown as the large scale focus of attention in these repeated pots is that gesture of incense burning. So the figure in the house in these versions is so small that you really can't see much detail on them at all. Whereas the standing figure who holds a flexible bag that contained incense is made very large so that we can see lots of detail on their costume. If we take that same principle of what are we being shown rather than what do we think we're seeing, we can also see that in this case, the house itself with its roof is as large and greatly overpowers the small figure seated inside. And the house with its feline sitting on the roof becomes a kind of a focus of the art as well. So it's not just the humans we should be paying attention to. We also need to pay attention to the non-humans of various kinds that are active in these kinds of scenes. When we start actually thinking about this gesture of burning tree resins, incense, as a central focus of the visual culture of this area, the attention is shifted from the person seated to the people actively doing the rituals. Now we could say, okay, they may be the community leaders, but there are people doing these rituals everywhere across the valley. So we're no longer concentrating power or authority in one set of hands. We've multiplied forms of authority. The same can be done with the musical practitioners, which you see on the bottom here. In the bottom scene, there are pairs of dancers facing each other wearing feline helmets with spots all over their faces and sort of feline jaguar mouths covering their mouths. Musical instruments are in fact also a very common part of the visual culture of this area. And they are discarded around every house. They appear in human-looking forms, in animal-looking forms, and in forms that blur the line between humans and animals, as in this pair of monkeys wearing necklaces and with ear ornaments. So humanized animals or animalized humans would take your choice there. When we start looking at these things as evidence of where music is being played and produced as part of everyday life, again, these ceremonies that involve music are taking place throughout every household, no matter how humble we have excavated. And it's that musical performance which is really being foregrounded in the pot that we're seeing, rather than the person seated in that small building, with the small building itself potentially being more important than the person seated in it. So we come back to this terrain of 500 houses, villages, and towns, and begin to see it not as a territory that's bounded and ruled by people seated at Travessia, but as a network of people engaging in the same kinds of ceremonial actions, spending a great deal of effort supporting artists who can develop that kind of expertise. And that leads us to the question of, how do we characterize this? And what you're seeing right here is two different ways of taking that same map and dividing it up. On the right is the thing that's closest to the actual data, the phenomena, what's on the ground, which is depicting in white every single platform on which a set of buildings is built. And there you can see that you have a continuous settlement along all of the river courses, with a few of the settlements having a slightly larger size, Travessia. On the left is what archaeologists have conventionally made of things like this, designating places like Travessia, which is right in the middle of your screen, or CR 132, which is up to the top. And I defy you to figure out which of those buildings in that thing is CR 132. I happen to know because I gave it that number. But taking those places, the key is they both have ball courts, and then drawing territories around them and saying, well, this is what Travessia controlled, was this territory. But we do that because we live in nation states, so we think people must always have lived in bounded territories. So what do we replace that territorial logic with? We need to replace it in each case with something that's rooted in its own locality. We can look at, this is a three-dimensional sculpture that's close to life size that Alua Valley people made a series of these, amazing, each one unique. We can look at something like this and say, well, that is the king, that is the ruler, that is the chief, because usually people think of this as a chiefdom level society. Or we could look at that thing and the other ones like it, including one of a pregnant woman dancing with a box on her back in which the bones of ancestors are contained. And we can say what we're being shown is, like on the pottery, the people engaged in ritual performances, which makes ritual performance by groups of people the focus here. So now we're moving radically away from what is in fact a very modern 20th century emphasis on the ruler, the leader, the central authority, to acknowledge that it's actually quite difficult on these pots. It's not accidental that the scene goes around the pot. It's very difficult to figure out who should be the leader here. This is a musical, and there's a set of musicians, 3 musicians, and then there's a person carrying the incense bag and a person holding a handheld incense burner in their hand. So this particular scene combines both of those things. So we have 5 people to choose from. Who's the beginning of this? Who's the ruler? Who's in charge? Does that even make sense as a question? Because what they have presented us thematically is a group of people participating together to carry out the ceremony, which is important to them. I then turn to draw on the descendant Lenka people who continue to do ceremonies today called Compostura, which is a Spanish word meaning repair. They repair the earth, alternatively called payments to the earth. But Compostura is actually a more powerful way of talking about this, because it makes it clear that it's about reciprocal obligation. As the unfortunately anonymous woman from La Campa said in this ethnographic account, We should pay the earth because if someone gives you a gift, shouldn't you repay that gift? Wouldn't you return it? Of course. It's the same with the earth. It gives us food. And it seems to me that we should pay back the gift. Reciprocity, interdependence, these are themes that we can use to, if not replace, at least complement what has been the emphasis in presenting ancient civilizations on command and the exercise of power. In these kinds of ceremonies, the Lenka today invite non-material spirits to inhabit various vehicles, some of them in the form of plants, some of them in the form of Christian crosses, some of them in the form of saints' images from the Roman Catholic religion, which has become dominant, to come and share a meal in repayment of that reciprocal debt. That kind of practice we can document in Spanish colonial sources. That kind of worldview, that kind of way of thinking about the world as a network of beings, humans and non-humans, that are interrelated together for the health of the world, is there in colonial petitions from indigenous people. This one from a town called Antigua, which is very close to the archaeological sites I've been showing you, where after complaining about being raided by Westerners, the people of Antigua ask to move their town, because if they don't, then the fruits of the cacao that God gave them to give succor, to give, to heal the earth, would be lost, and the earth would suffer. The earth would be lost in lacking the fruits that God gave us, and the poor earth would be lost. This is very powerful. The original Spanish is incredibly powerful. This is the kind of thing that Lenka people in ancestral Lenka territory were enacting in those kinds of things we were looking at. Now, here's the theoretical part, and I'll try and do this very quickly. This aligns this work with recent threads often called anarchist theory. Anarchist theory questions the inevitability of organizations of humans with somebody in command. It emphasizes the idea that humans can, and indeed through much of their history have, organized themselves collaboratively, whether with overlapping kinds of responsibilities or rotational kinds of responsibilities, and that the fact that we live in a world in which power is concentrated hierarchically today doesn't actually mean that that is the norm for humans, and it has not been normal in most of human history. David Graeber, the late David Graeber, and his collaborator David Wenger, whose piece you've read, talk about this specifically in terms of this question of the emergence of inequality. The political scientist and historical political scientist James Scott, in writing about Southeast Asia, revisits a classic case where there are hierarchical societies ruled by kings that are in connection with neighboring societies that anthropologists have had a hard time understanding, because they seem sometimes to have more centralized authority and sometimes to have no centralized authority. And that fluctuation back and forth turns out to be the key. People don't live in one system rigidly. They move back and forth according to their needs strategically. So if we emphasize the governance, we're taking the position of the state or the government. If instead we look at the reciprocity, we're looking at the people who may choose not to be governed, who may contest governance, who may collaborate in the reciprocal process. And that's what most of the visual culture in the area that I work in, that was produced between 500 and 1000 AD, actually elevates, is these collaborative and cooperative groups of people where it would be very, very difficult to pick, again, who's in charge. And that's even true at sites like Travessia, these places that have one household that has more labor invested in its house architecture, that has unusual building materials, a place that nonetheless celebrates in its really quite awful visual culture, this is not the best Alua stuff, but this is Travasia's Alua stuff, still celebrates reciprocity, the collaboration by pairs of people. Even though the people seated in that stuccoed place might have wanted to see themselves seated on their throne as in charge, they were aware of and dependent on other people. We know that the people of Travasia tried to position themselves as more central than others. They deliberately built their household at the intersection of two axes, one of which is widely shared in the valley and points to a sacred mountain on the south near a sacred lake, and the other one intersecting the rising sun on the winter solstice. So they tried to say, we're central to the universe. And by patronizing the production of these amazing marble vases and giving them as gifts, the little white dots are marble vases, giving them as gifts to other people, they tried to make other people dependent on them. But all the little black dots are ceramic copies that were made locally. People weren't dependent on the marble vases. They could make their own versions of marble vases in ceramics. So Travasia's ruling leading family tried to assert that they were more equal than others, and the people in the valley didn't give in. And that's what we see over and over in this history of anarchic societies, is that it's a contest, a struggle. Local people emerge, and so at the site of Tenampua, another of these Honduran sites, around 800 to 900 AD, some people literally import thrones, special thrones that not everybody gets, and have themselves painted, seated on those thrones. But on the other side of their same vessels, there's still the people burning incense in pairs. And if you turn that vessel, you can ignore the ruler and pay attention to the reciprocal obligation that humans had through burning incense to keep the world healthy, to succor the earth. I wanted to leave, I'm sorry, I think I took a little more time than I intended, but I wanted to leave time really for us to talk. And I want to say that I'd be happy to discuss any of this further with anyone here, especially because I think in introducing this earlier in the educational curriculum can have profound effects on people's lives. And thank you again for giving me this opportunity.